Welcome back. Today we're jumping straight into a really fascinating explainer. We're unpacking a highly provocative argument that challenges the actual bedrock of modern macroeconomics. We're looking at Dr. Carmelo Ferlito's CME policy paper number 7, titled Beyond Price Stability, along with insights from his recent interview on BFM 89.9. Now, if you think you've got a solid handle on how central banks operate and what really makes a healthy economy tick, well, get ready to have some of those assumptions seriously tested. Okay, let's dive right into this. The core premise we're exploring today comes from the Center for Market Education, and it's a highly unorthodox idea. It's the argument that traditional central banking, and specifically its absolute obsession with just price stability, keeping consumer inflation right around that magic 2% mark, might actually be the exact thing causing catastrophic economic crises. We're going to unpack why artificially fixing the price of money could literally be the root cause of the massive boom and bust cycles we've all lived through.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. First up, rethinking monetary policy. Second, the 3 interest rates. Third, beyond price stability. Fourth, diagnosing monetary disorder. And we'll wrap up with radical policy recommendations.
All right, Section 1, Rethinking Monetary Policy, a Paradigm Shift.
To really grasp this, we've kind of got to unlearn some conventional wisdom. See, the mainstream view treats the entire economy like this highly predictable top-down machine. You know the picture. Central planners sitting at a massive dashboard, pulling levers, tweaking the money supply here, adjusting interest rates there, fully expecting a perfectly calculated outcome. Like, oh, we'll just lower unemployment by exactly 0.5%. But Dr. Ferlito argues that we need a major paradigm shift. The economy is absolutely not a machine. It's a complex, evolving, bottom-up organism. It's what you call an emergent order, driven by literally millions of human actions, interactions, and sentiments every single day. And when you try to force a living, breathing organism into a rigid, top-down cage, well, you get some incredibly painful, unintended consequences.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 interest rates, demystifying the jargon.
To truly understand the root of the problem, we first have to isolate the primary tool of monetary policy, which is, of course, interest rates. Dr. Ferlito breaks this down into 3 distinct concepts. The first one is the Originary Rate, or OR. Think of this as the psychological bedrock of the whole economy. It simply reflects a society's true time preference. Essentially, how present or future-oriented are people right now? If people are saving heavily for the future, their time preference is low, meaning the Originary Rate is low. It's an organic, constantly evolving reflection of actual human behavior. It is definitely not a hard number you can just look up on a financial terminal.
The second concept is the market rate, or MR. Now, this is the rate that arises totally naturally in a completely free, unhampered market for loanable funds. It's driven purely by the actual supply of savings and the real demand for investment. In a genuinely free market, this price perfectly coordinates the plans of savers and borrowers, right? It ensures that the massive investments being made by businesses are actually backed up by real, tangible societal savings. And finally, we have the central bank rate, the CBR. This is that reference discount rate determined politically by a central authority. Think the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. Now, the absolutely critical issue here is that the CBR is entirely disconnected from true societal time preference. It's a completely artificial signal that gets overlaid right on top of the natural market. Ferlito essentially describes it as acting like a puppet master, trying to guide the economy toward arbitrary policy targets rather than letting it find its own organic equilibrium.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict here. You've got the originary and market rates, which are organic, bottom-up reflections of real human choices and natural supply and demand. And sitting right squarely on top of them is the central bank rate, this top-down, discretionary policy tool. The problem is, when the central bank rate deviates from the actual market rate, it broadcasts massive false signals to the entire economic system. Which leads us to Section 3, Beyond Price Stability, Defining True Welfare. This brings us to a major critique of modern central bank mandates. For decades, these institutions have been hyper-focused on hitting a 2% inflation target. But as Dr. Ferlito notes, and I quote, "Pursuing price stability does not impede the emergence of asset bubbles and business fluctuations." This is a massive realization. It means you can successfully keep the price of everyday things perfectly stable and simultaneously be blowing up a catastrophic bubble in the housing market or the stock market. Obsessing over consumer price stability alone is a fundamentally flawed indicator of true economic health.
So if a 2% inflation target isn't the holy grail we thought it was, what exactly should we be aiming for? Well, the paper proposes a looser, much more realistic set of goals. First is sustainable growth. Notice that's not necessarily constant, aggressive GDP expansion at all costs, but rather steady economic progress with minimal boom and bust cycles. Second is social welfare. In this context, that's defined as the maximum natural employment that the current structure of production can actually support, basically avoiding artificial, debt-fueled jobs that just vanish when the music stops. And third, currency stability, ensuring relative prices can adjust naturally without these massive external policy shocks.
All right, let's look at Section 4, Diagnosing Monetary Disorder, the Anatomy of a Crisis. Let's move on and see how this well-intentioned intervention actually builds into a full-blown crisis. Step 1. The central bank artificially lowers the CBR below the natural market rate, usually to stimulate growth. This immediately injects excess liquidity into the system. Step 2. All this incredibly cheap money sends a totally false signal to investors. They look at the low rates, believe society has abundant savings, and embark on massive long-term capital projects. Economists call this malinvestment. Step 3. Because these new investments aren't actually backed by real consumer savings, that excess liquidity has to go somewhere. It frantically chases yields, blowing up massive asset bubbles or triggering severe currency instability.
Look at this simple image of a market transaction here. In a healthy economy, the person producing the apple and the person buying it are perfectly coordinated by true market prices. But when central banks artificially suppress interest rates, it creates this massive disconnect. Investors are essentially tricked into building huge long-term projects, say a massive new high-tech infrastructure grid, because the cost of borrowing is just so impossibly low. But the reality is, consumers haven't actually saved their money. They still want present goods right now, like that apple. When those massive long-term projects finally realize there's no actual consumer demand or real savings to sustain them, well, the boom abruptly turns into a devastating bust.
And look, this isn't just academic theory. Ferlito traces the symptoms of this exact monetary disorder right through our recent history. The 2008 financial crisis? That was fueled by artificially low rates that pushed massive excess liquidity, not into everyday consumer prices, but into a colossal real estate and CDO bubble. Or look more recently, the stunning collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the wild bubbles in the tech sector, or even the August 2024 Black Monday currency shakeups over in Asia. These are all manifestations of this exact same fever. The massive monetary injections from the COVID-19 era didn't just cause consumer inflation, they fundamentally distorted global asset markets and currencies across the board.
Bringing us to our final section, Section 5, Radical Policy Recommendations, Fixing the Foundation.
So the crucial point is, how do we fix a system that is seemingly hardwired for these massive distortions? Well, Ferlito presents these policy recommendations as theoretical exercises to prove a very specific point. The absolute key formula to understand here is this. MR equals NR equals OR. True macroeconomic stability is really only achieved when the market rate perfectly aligns with the natural rate, which itself is a pure reflection of the originary rate. To put that in plain English, the price of borrowing money literally must match society's actual real-world desire to save money. Any artificial deviation from this natural equilibrium basically guarantees a future crisis.
To actually achieve this, the paper outlines a pretty radical framework. First up, abolish the central bank rate entirely. Just get rid of it and allow interest rates to fluctuate freely based purely on natural market supply and demand. Second, enforce strict constitutional balanced budgets. Because honestly, monetary discipline is completely useless if governments can just endlessly deficit spend their way out of problems. And third, limit commercial bank deposit creation. This is to prevent banks from magically expanding the broader money supply every single time they issue a new loan. Ultimately, it's all about reestablishing hard, real-world limits on the creation of money.
Now, what's really interesting about this final slide is that it leaves us with a profound philosophical question, and frankly, a plea for some real humility in economic policy. If the global economy truly is a highly complex, emergent, living organism, do a handful of central planners sitting in a room really possess the superhuman knowledge required to perfectly steer it? Or does trying to constantly micromanage the price of money ultimately do significantly more harm than good? It is a deeply challenging perspective, and one that forces us to rethink absolutely everything we know about financial stability. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the explainer. Keep questioning the consensus, and I'll catch you next time.